about geotourism. I love this topic because I love to travel, but I'll be honest, I'm a little concerned if I'm a little concerned about something called over tourism, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. Over tourism is when too many people pack into too few places. Okay, sustainable travel for the future. Here we go. We're going to talk about what geotourism is and how we can use the principles to be better citizens of the world. I should say also better travelers of the world. I think travel is really, really beneficial. We all benefit, not just like as consumers, we benefit as being better citizens of the world. What is geotourism? By the way, that is that's Eiger in Switzerland, in case you were wondering. It combines, my definition, it combines slow travel with green travel and just travel. If you've taken any of my classes on slow travel, you'll know that I like to go slow and dig deep wherever I go. Green travel means I like to tread as lightly on the earth and its resources as I travel. And just travel means I also want to be very aware of how tourism affects locals. So it combines, I'm going to be talking about those three things. So there is sort of a formal framework and definition for geotourism that I did not invent, and we'll talk about that today. So I take no claim to inventing the term or anything like that. I just read about it. First of all, just to know, travel has impact on the places that you travel to, the places you visit. That is an island called Inchcolm in the Firth of Forth. A firth is like a wide estuary in Scotland, and the Firth of Forth is an estuary that comes in from the east. And on the south edge of the Firth is the city of Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland. And if in the middle of that Firth, which is about 10 miles wide, you have maybe more. You have Inchcolm, which is a little island that had an abbey on it. My wife and I took a boat out there one day. Anyway, that's where that was. Travel has big impacts on the places we visit. And that's where a lot of this comes from. So let me just talk a little bit about, there's many aspects, many impacts, by the way. I'm going to talk a bit about environmental impacts, but there are many impacts on places that you visit. So someone remind me to tell you about Airbnb and its impact. Don't let me forget that in case I miss it in this class. But just talking about carbon footprint, this is the one that a lot of people think about in terms of green travel. Global tourism has a big carbon footprint. Half of it is just transportation, and most of that is airfare or air travel. Local travel on trains or buses or foot or bicycle have very minimal impact compared to the impact of flying. Flying is an interesting thing. Airplanes actually are fairly efficient use of fuel. A full airplane uses the amount of fuel per mile, not unlike a train or a bus per person per mile. The problem is it puts its carbon in the upper stratosphere. So that carbon doesn't have to kind of find its way up where, like gets sucked up by trees or something on the way. It deposits all its carbons up there. So that's why air flying is a problem. These are all the other impacts. Goods like the stuff that you might buy, trinkets and souvenirs. And I just brought back some souvenirs for some kids that I mentor, my wife and I mentor, and they were like little keychains from Rome. They said made in China, it's kind of, Anyway, there's food and beverage, agriculture, services, keeping in mind that a lot of these are things which a person might use anyway. Like if I'm consuming food and beverage while I'm traveling, I'm also consuming it at home. Let's not forget that. So the biggest thing is getting to someplace by plane. That's the biggest use of carbon. That's where it has the biggest impact. But there are many places in the world that are known as being over-touristed. You can research this and find out what some of them are. Some of those places are like, in Europe, they're like Amsterdam, Barcelona, some of these favorite places that many of us would like to go to. It just means that there's probably more people visiting there than should be. Florence, where I was just last year, is also listed as an over-touristed place. So when there are too many people there, it has several negative impacts, not just the number of people in per inch in a place. But for example, this is where I'll mention Airbnb. Airbnb, by the way, Prague is another place. And the reason I mention these is because Barcelona and Amsterdam are two cities where a lot of folks own property. And they said, you know what, instead of renting out that apartment to somebody who is a local, I'm going to rent it out as an Airbnb. I can make a lot more money. And so as Airbnb proliferated, I think this was an unintentional side effect of Airbnb, was housing for locals became expensive and scarce. Anytime something becomes scarce, it becomes expensive. And so when the pandemic hit and suddenly a lot of these places didn't have tourists, the locals came out and said, you know, we really like our town. Maybe we want it back. And so in some of these places, I'm thinking of Prague and Amsterdam. There are Prague and Amsterdam. Those are two places where the locals thought a lot about, can they limit tourism for the future so they can have their city back? But even though I've taught a class on Airbnb, I use it, and there is on its face nothing the matter with Airbnb. It can't have this one negative side, and when a place is over touristed, that the locals might find housing prices go up because it's scarce. So anyway, with that in mind, let me talk about some of the principles of geotourism. These are kind of like things that I want to keep in mind when I'm going somewhere, and I want to encourage you also as you travel this year, whether you're traveling, by the way, within your state, if you're in America, I think you all are, or whether you're traveling abroad. Number one is to spend time and money in ways that sustain local character. This is a photo. This picture I put in here is from Munich, München, in Bavaria, Germany. It's the Augustiner Brauhaus. Augustiner is one of the I don't know, 4 major breweries in Munich, and I like Augustiner for several reasons. I don't know that there's that big of a difference between the beers in each of those breweries, but Augustiner doesn't put any preservatives in their beer, so it's very hard to get here in the U.S. But Augustiner, the company, specifically donates its profits back to a charity. So I like that principle. And I discovered that because my wife and I went on a local tour of Munich. We found the place and the guy who gives local tours. And he took us on like a 2.5-hour tour, and he explained about the breweries, because when you're in Munich, if he's not telling you mostly about beer, you are missing it, because the München, the word is from, it was a place of monks. It was a monastery first. It was a monastery was located there before the city. And when they look back at and they have records, by the way, from that time when the settlement, and the monks were raising hops, and there's really only one reason to raise hops, that is to put them in beer. So way back in like the 9th century, when they have first recorded records of in Munich, and it was the monks. That's where the word München comes from, the monks. That's a monk in German, or the monks. München would be monks. They were brewing beer. So and that's all that's the big thing about Bavaria, and a lot of people know because of Oktoberfest, which, by the way, is not really particularly a German custom. It was after the Second World War, when Americans were based in Germany, and I think Bavaria was the kind of the American sector, inside the American sector, the Germans discovered that the Americans loved a big beer fest. And so they kind of took this obscure thing, which had once upon a time been celebrating the wedding of like Napoleon's stepdaughter to some Bavarian prince, or maybe it was his stepson to a Bavarian princess, I've forgotten. It was the original Oktoberfest. They revived it, and now it's like this big beer fest But the locals revived it like in the 1950s for the sake of American servicemen who apparently like to drink beer. Anyway, so this is like, I like Augustiner because of the company. So my wife and I went there and had a meal. And of course I had a tall Augustiner beer. So anyway, it sustains local character. And that's a really important thing, is spend your money on the local, first of all, find out about that local character, and then spend your money that way. Secondly, value your destination. Oh, by the way, that's true even if you're in the US. So I tell people, if you're in town here in Harrisonburg, you want a beer, we have 3 local microbreweries that really make good beer. We have lots of good local restaurants. You don't have to eat the chains. We have some excellent ethnic foods, everything from Mexican to Central Latin American general to Indonesian to Indian, Chinese, and Italian, of course, the classic ethnic foods. That's all here in Harrisonburg. So if you're in town, that's where I recommend you go eat. Value the destination's natural and cultural heritage. Okay, this is a scene from Berlin. My wife and I and son hosted an exchange student from near Berlin. And one of the great things about having exchange students is they always invite you to come visit them. So we did. And that's actually my wife here in the kind of, I don't know what you call this kind of colored shirt she's wearing. This is Barbara, our host. That's our exchange student's mom. They took us down into Berlin for the day, and it was nice having some locals. What was more interesting than just going to Berlin was the fact that Barbara and her husband, so our exchange student's parents, grew up in the East Bloc. So they grew up in East Germany. Berlin was a divided city during the Cold War, and they grew up sort of in the suburbs. So they were living in East Germany, which surrounded Berlin. And they told us a lot about what it was like to grow up in a divided city. And this little spot right here is the place where they preserved some of the Berlin Wall. I'm not sure that the wall actually ran. I don't think it ran right where it is right there. There are places you can go and still find the original wall up. They didn't tear it down everywhere, but they cut down a few panels and they brought them into this plaza, which is just inside the old East Berlin from West Berlin. So if you imagine where my wife is standing and I'm taking the picture, to our backs is the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag, which were like, the Reichstag was in West Berlin, and the Brandenburg Tor Gate actually was right on the wall. It was a no man's land. And we're reading about what it was like to live in a divided Berlin. So I love history and culture, and that's one thing I do. And so our host took us and we learned all about what it was like to live in a divided Berlin and a divided Germany. By the way, any comments or questions so far about money, spending money in local character, learning natural cultural heritage? I like to visit cathedrals in Europe. I always like to throw this one in. That's Canterbury Cathedral there on the left, which I first visited in 1998 and went back to visit again in 2008. And it was in Canterbury Cathedral. I had my eyes opened to this thing called, I call it cathedral graffiti, that people have been scratching things on these sort of sacred stone walls for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I discovered that in Canterbury Cathedral. I walked through it the first time and didn't notice it because I was way too awed by just looking at this whole immense space. I'd never been in a cathedral like that in my life before I went there in 1998. But when I went back in 2008, I stopped and looked at one of the columns in there and I saw initials and dates scratched in it. And now I can't not see it anywhere in a cathedral or old church. I've learned a whole lot more about it. The one on the right is actually some graffiti, which is interesting. It says Harry Copper was sworn bell ringer in the year of our Lord 1545. That's actually in Winchester Cathedral. I like this guy he left a memorial to himself in the cathedral that he was the bell ringer If you know anybody with the last name Bellringer, that's where the name comes from. Here's kind of in my opinion, at least, a bit of a sullying of the local character. This is in Stratford upon Avon, and that's High Street. In England, Main Street is High Street. We even have a few high streets here in the US if the towns are old enough. Actually, my town is old enough to have a high street, believe it or not. And I'm a bet behind where I'm standing taking this picture. So I'm looking across High Street. I'm standing at the behind me are the ruins of or the remains, the foundations of Shakespeare's house, not where he was born, not Shakespeare's birthplace, which is still in existence, but Shakespeare's home. When he made a lot of money and came back to Stratford at the end of his life, he bought a house, and the house is gone, but the foundation is there. You can see the foundations directly across the street. I just thought this is a little tacky. That is like, a 16th century half timbered British building, with its wavy lines and nothing perpendicular anymore. And the base and the bottom was like Pizza Hut. I kind of went, ugh. Anyway, the British probably love it. We tend to forget that they like American things. Principle number 3. So we've got spending your money in ways to support local character, learning the cultural traditions, respect local customs and traditions and learn them. I went to Switzerland in 2014, actually the same year that I was in Berlin, the same trip. We went to Switzerland for a week. And I didn't know before I went there that the cheese was a huge deal in Switzerland. Just didn't know that. I knew about Swiss cheese, but there's cheddar cheese, Swiss cheese, Gruyere cheese, who knows what was, and actually what I discovered about cheese in Switzerland had nothing to do with the cheese that has holes in it that we call Swiss cheese. They make a big deal about their cheese, and that's because a lot of rural Switzerland, they drove the cows into the upland pastures in the summer, and the pastures were green with grasses and wildflowers and all sorts of cool things. And so in June, they took maybe late May, they started driving the cattle into the upland pastures. You can see how green it is up here on looking at that saddle of the mountain over there and how green it is in this place. But then here's the point is that the people that own the cattle have these homes up in the mountains, summer homes near where the cattle graze, and they make cheese there. We stayed with a local for a week, and they had a little guest apartment, and she told us all about cheese, told us all the places to go to about cheese, and I had no idea. This is a place where you can see these little umbrellas. People walk to this place. You can drive there, but tradition, and they often like to go on long walks for a day. They'd walk up to this place and stop, and they have a sandwich and coffee or something in the cafe. But meanwhile, really behind it is a bustling agroturismo, where there's cows in the barn back there. They're milking, and they're making cheese in these enormous vats that are like 50-gallon drums. Maybe if you've ever seen a 50-gallon steam kettle, they're like that. And I had no idea how they do it. They boil the milk until it separates into curds and wheys, just like Little Miss Muffet. And they make cheese out of the curds. And what the guy did, this was amazing. I never would imagine this. He rolled up his sleeves and he thrust his arms into ice water with ice as long as he could bear it. And when he couldn't stand it anymore, he pulled his arms out and he grabbed a piece of cheesecloth, and he with two hands, and he thrust the cheesecloth down into the boiling milk, wrapped it around a whole big wad of curds, and lifted it out. So the ice in his arms was to kind of protect him against the boiling hot milk. And then he laid the curd in the cheesecloth inside a mold that was about 12 inches around and 12 inches in diameter and about 6 inches high, a big disc. And that was how they made the cheese. That's the start of the cheese making process. And that sits there and it begins to cool. And then when it's solid enough that they can do something with it, then they take the mold off and they put the cheese in a place to keep, and it will keep for years. It's not unlike, say, whiskey or something or wine that they let sit for years. They let it sit for years and it gets harder and harder and it gets tastier and tastier. And so just like a wine of certain vintages or like a 15-year-old Scotch, the older the cheese is, like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years old, the harder it is and the tastier it is, the more flavorful it is, I should say. I didn't know any of this. So we even brought some of this hard cheese back from Switzerland. It was really good. And I love it to this day. Anyway, we learned all about a tradition I didn't even know existed when we went there. And we passed a bunch of those cows, with their big bells that are all tuned to different notes. And when a herd of them is going by, it's like, they're in tune with each other and harmonizing. Number 4, express appreciation to local people about the things you find unique and interesting about the place: history, architecture, cuisine, nature, scenery, and music. So this is another one of those local tours that I go on. I often look for free ones. By the way, here's the reason I like free tours. Number 1, they're free, so anybody can go. I never stiff a tour guide. We always give a tour guide a generous tip. But someone told me once that they think the free tour guides do better tours than paid ones because they have to do a good job to get your money. This is a guy named Patrick that took us on a walking tour to the Cliffs of Moher. The Cliffs of Moher on Western Ireland, they're one of the most famous places on the Western shore because they're like, I don't know, 800 or 900 feet above the sea. They're dramatic, they're beautiful. And tour buses roll up one after another and crowds get out. We did it a different way. We were in the town of Doolin, about 5 miles north of the cliffs. And this guy, Patrick, holding the flag, is a local. He's actually a farmer that owns a strip of land that comes all the way down to the western coast. And he does walking tours. There's a path that now goes from Doolin 5 miles north to the Cliffs of Moher. And it crosses about 26 landowners' pieces of property. They all little strips that go down to the ocean. And this guy spearheaded in 2009 a project to design a walking path. And the financial meltdown of 2008 hit Ireland especially bad. They were a center of finance, business startups, and they got zapped badly. And so he and other locals said, we're not going to take this lying down. We think that where we live, this was Doolin, is a great place for tourism. And we're going to build this path. And he announced it at a town meeting. People all said he was crazy. But sure enough, within about 4 or 5 years, he convinced all but one of 26 landowners to give a right-of-way on the edge of their property to build a walking path along the coast. And now he leads tours all the way from Doolin to the cliffs. So we saw the cliffs totally unlike anyone who's rolling up in a tour bus would see. And it was fabulous. And what was really cool was along the way, he stopped and told us all sorts of little snippets about the history of the area, about Irish history, and all in his Irish brogue, which was lovely, including he taught us about something called scurvy grass, which is this pinkish flower that grows all along the coast. And it's rich in vitamin C. And the people that were emigrating to America used to go gather a basket full of it and pack it with them for the journey on the boats because it would keep them from getting scurvy on the way over. They were taking third class, the cheapest way. He showed us where a hurricane had hit the coast, and he showed us a boulder that easily had to weigh 10 tons, had been lifted. He said, I remember when that boulder was down there in the water, and he showed it, sitting up next to the fence. He said that storm was so bad, it moved that boulder up. Anyway, it was fabulous. So found this local guy giving a tour. He still does these, by the way, because my daughter was in Doolin last June, and they were going to take a tour with this guy, but it was raining that day and he canceled the tour. So anyway, we always look out for these. Any kind of tour I look for, like I've taken distillery tours in Scotland. I've taken a prison tour in Dublin. I've taken that walking tour. If they're available, I look for them. Yes, Jillian.
When you're talking about the going on free tours with locals, Have you found a site particularly, or do you just ask around and ask people who does what?
I
Because
ask
I've done
around.
some of that. Yeah.
I ask around. I found out about him because the owner of the bed and breakfast that we're staying at told us about him. I found about a free tour a city tour in Munich because I went up to the desk in the hotel. We were staying just in a hotel for 2 nights or maybe 3 nights, I forget. And I just went to the desk. I said, "Are there any city tours?" She goes, "Oh yes, Marienplatz, 11 o'clock in the morning." We had been in York that year, and we were staying in an Airbnb that was kind of like a hostel. There were like 4 rooms for rent, and it's a gigantic home. And we were gathering to make our breakfast, and all the other people staying there were gathered together, and we were chatting. And somebody said they were going to the local tour, and we said, "Oh, good. Where is it? What time?" So we usually ask. Another good place to find out is the tourist information office. Nearly every place has one. There are, and I don't want to say if it's a paid tour, it's bad. That's not necessarily true. But I've pretty much I've just become a huge fan of local tours. They are really the way to go. And so when I
I've
do
done quite a few.
yes, and I've even given one. I mean, I did a local tour for somebody here in Harrisonburg. It was kind of informal. Some people that were biking, and I showed them around. I hope to lead a tour on the Great Allegheny Passage and the C&O towpath up here along the Potomac someday. I've done tours, I should say. I have been a tour guide along those bike rails or trails. So I've boned up on all my local history. And when I went in the Great Allegheny Passage, I was essentially a local. So yeah, excellent question. How to find out about them? Ask. By the way, I've done a whole class in the past on guidebooks. I'm still a big guidebook guy, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on guidebooks because they're typically found in library sales, thrift stores, secondhand bookshops, because travel guides are issued new every year. And so if you get one that's 2 or 3 years old, it's like $1. And most of the information there is perfectly good. All the information about history never changes. And I took a copy of Rick Steves' Rome guide with me when I was in Rome last time, and he told about a bunch of stuff, including some tours. I didn't take any that day because I had my own kind of work, my own little tour planned out. But they'll also tell you Rick Steves is the best resource for local tours. Because he uses local tour guides everywhere. Vote with your wallet. Spend money that supports the local economy. It's kind of what I said in the very first point, but use inns, restaurants, tours, shops, bed and breakfasts, anything that deters from the local character you can avoid. Okay, I'm not saying that you can't stay in a hotel chain, but we tend to look for places that are run by locals. Also remember that whenever you spend your money locally, it circulates around the economy 5 times before it disappears out of the local economy. So that's a big difference between spending money on a corporate experience. That's Cornucopia, by the way, in Dublin. If you go there, it is a whole food and vegetarian restaurant in Ireland where the main dish is lamb. It was excellent. My wife either stumbled on this or knew about it, and it took us there about 3 times when we were in Dublin. It was her favorite place. They even have a cookbook. You can get the Cornucopia cookbook. Enrich yourself with experiences and stories that you can share with others. Another tour I've done, actually I've done a class on this, is a coffee tour in Colombia. So when I went there, I've been there twice and we'll go back there tomorrow. In fact, when the weather gets real cold here, I'd really like to go to Colombia, where it's like a day in spring every day. When I was there in last time, almost 5 years ago, I went with my son, who's on the right, and his wife, who's with the red hair there. We went to the coffee region, and we did 2 coffee tours, or I should say 2 coffee farm tours. And the guy in the center told us all about not just growing. He's a campesino. He's from the countryside. He's a coffee farmer. He told us not only about growing coffee, but he told us all about all the local flora and fauna. By the way, these big bushy things growing up behind him are wild coffee plants. They're just, I mean, coffee is not native to Colombia. And in fact, directly behind him, this might be bamboo. I'm not sure. That's also not native to Colombia. So the area, but there's also plenty of local stuff that he showed us about. So he just told us all about local plants. I learned that a banana tree is like a one-shot deal. It grows up in 1 year. It goes from 0 to 12 feet in 1 year, puts out a big bunch of bananas, like a 2 to 3 foot bunch, and then that's it. And then a new one, you cut it down, a new plant banana tree comes out at the base. I think also bananas are not native to Colombia either, but they grow well with coffee, under the shade of coffee. The world's pretty much got natives, non-native species everywhere. So anyway, but he told us all about how everything about the local area. It was a great tour. It was 2 hours. Ava gave us a meal at the end. Enrich yourself with experiences and stories that you can share with others. This is another, that's the same point I'm on. This was I've been now 3 times in Italy, going back at least once more this year. When we go somewhere at a restaurant, we just say, what's the local pasta? What's the local dish? What's your specialty? Oh, they tell us what it is. Well, I say, unless it sounds like something I don't want to eat, which hasn't happened yet, we ask for that. It's usually some form of pasta. And the lady on the left, this guy's our waiter, and the chef is his mother, and she made us this excellent pasta dish, which I love. I loved. I had pasta most nights in Italy. It's great for walking. And she just wanted to come out and make sure that the meal was good, that we enjoyed it. We said we did like it. So that's just what I say if you're in Italy, and we even went to a genuine, authentic Italian restaurant may not even have a menu. If they're open for lunch, you walk in and they just, what do you want? Well, where's your menu? We don't have one. Okay. Would you like some pasta? Yes. And they give you 2 or 3 different types of pasta you can choose, and a drink and maybe a salad, whatever you ask for. Very informal. So what I did when I was in Rome this last time, there's a thing called the Pilgrim Churches of Rome. You can walk around, but I did a little different. A friend of mine said to me, "Oh, when you're in Rome next time, you need to look for the old mosaics." So I specially went for places that had really old mosaics. Some of it were as old as like the 7th or 6th century. A lot of it very Byzantine influence. Some of it was later and was medieval, like 12th century, still 1,000 years old. This is a mosaic from a church that is really old in Rome. That's the apse. There's a lot of the apses are semicircular, and then they have I call it like a quarter sphere above the apse where they had these mosaics. And I learned something new. So just to make sure people didn't get confused, people with figures with halos are saints. If the person was alive at the time that the work was commissioned or done, their halo is square. Who would have known? I also discovered that a lot of these churches have very few windows, because windows weren't enclosed, didn't have glass back like 1,500 years ago. So they wanted to prevent the elements from coming in. They made the windows relatively small. And so there's not a lot of light. And so I have no idea how they saw these things with candlelight. They must have somehow. But now, if you're in the front of an old church in Italy or like Rome like this, they usually have a box up in the front that you put a euro in or a 50-cent piece in, and they'll light up for a few minutes, and they'll illuminate the mosaic for you. So that was my special tour this last time. I wanted to find out about all the old mosaics in Italy. I also did a round through some of the sanctuaries of St. Francis. That's Greccio, which, like most of his sanctuaries, seem to have been built upon a rock. It almost looks like the thing is emerging right out of the rock it was built on. And that's part of the tour I'll be doing in Italy. Is we'll be doing 3 or 4 of his sanctuaries, places he used to go to escape to. They all start out as caves. The next thing you know, there's a church there. This one's got a church and a monastery.